Well, welcome to the Daily Word. I'm Jeremiah. We are in Galatians 1 today. So let's dive in to Galatians 1. Just want to look at the first 5 verses with you today. To start with, Galatians is written by Paul. It's one of his 13 epistles. Paul writes to the believers in Galatia. This is the province of Galatia, and this would be in sort of Central Asia Minor. Paul's writing to churches in cities such as Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra. And these are actually all churches that Paul planted back in Acts 13 and Acts 14. You could read about that in those 2 chapters of Acts. But these are churches that Paul planted. Well, after he planted them, after he preached the gospel, after God graciously saved some, then Paul left, right? He continued to preach Christ and plant churches. That was done in his first missionary journey. Well, when he left, false teachers swooped in. These false teachers were known as Judaizers because they were men who believed in order for a Gentile to become a Christian, that Gentile had to adhere to Mosaic law. Basically, he had to become a Jewish proselyte, a Jewish believer. He had to follow Mosaic law, dietary law, ceremonial law. And so what these Judaizers were doing, these false teachers who had invaded the Galatian churches, is they were saying, no, it's not about grace only, it's grace plus works. You must keep the law in order to be saved, which of course was a perversion of the real gospel. So Paul is compelled to write this letter to the Galatians because a false gospel was being promoted, and these were dear believers to Paul. He couldn't stand to see them believe in a false gospel. So that's the nature of the writing of Galatians. And so he is calling them back to the true gospel. And his message and his intent is clear from these first few verses. Look at verse 1. Paul says, hey, listen, I'm an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. Basically, he's establishing his credentials because the false preachers, the false teachers, had said, you can't trust Paul. His credibility is lacking. You need to believe us and believe our gospel message. Well, Paul says that's ridiculous. My message, and rather my authority, is derived precisely from God and from the risen Lord Jesus Christ. So not only is my authority valid because Christ appointed me, so is my gospel message because I got it from Christ. So he's establishing his credentials with which the false teachers had been denigrating. Then look at verse 3. Paul says, grace to you and peace. Well, that's his normal greeting. He gives that in basically all of his letters. But it takes on a different flavor here when you remember that he was writing to combat a twisted, perverse gospel. Now, grace is, of course, God's free favor, unmerited, unwarranted, given to sinners to save them. This isn't merely goodness of God. No, this is salvific grace by which God saves someone. And then, of course, peace is the result of having the grace of God. We have peace with God when we experience that saving grace. And so Paul even uses this greeting, which is customary, to remind them it's not about works. You didn't get saved by works. It's grace which leads to peace with God, not grace plus works which leads to peace. So even in this greeting, which is standard for Paul, it's a subtle reminder, Galatians, you didn't get saved by works. It was all about the grace of God. Now look down at verse 4. Paul says in verse 4, well, basically, he explains the gospel. And it's unusual that he would so quickly explain the gospel, but not in light of the situation happening in these churches. Again, they were abandoning the real gospel to accept a false gospel. They were being deceived, bewitched. He says that later on in the book. And so Paul gives them the gospel already in verse 4. And he does that in 4 simple parts. Part 1, he talks about the person. That's why he says in verse 4, well, actually the end of verse 3, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Because Christ is the heart of the gospel. It's all about him. Christianity is all about him. It's all about what Jesus did, not about what we did to complement or supplement it. It's all about what Christ has done. So he starts with the person of Christ, who, by the way, false teachers were denigrating by saying, oh, what Jesus did wasn't enough. You must add your works in order to be saved. So the person of Jesus Christ was essentially under attack when a false gospel was being preached, which said, what he did isn't sufficient. You must add your own works. So Paul starts in this gospel message with the person of Christ. Then he moves from the person to the price. Notice he says, verse 4, who gave himself. And he's emphasizing that it was Christ alone whose sacrifice matters. Nowhere in verse 4 do we find any mention of us. It's all about what Christ did. And so their defection, the Galatians' defection from the true gospel, is all the more reprehensible because they are cheapening the blood of Christ. Because remember, the gospel required the infinite blood of Christ, his payment, in order for the wrath of God to be satisfied, to be propitiated. And so Paul reminds them, no, the sacrifice of Christ is what was necessary, not your works, not your good deeds. Now he moves from the price to the purpose. Look at verse 4. The purpose was to deliver us. And again, it was Christ who died to deliver us. And to deliver is basically to rescue us, to save us from a situation in which we were utterly helpless. As if a baby were cast into the ocean and it would be a helpless situation. That baby could not rescue himself. It must have an outside person dive into the water, scoop the baby up, and put it on the rescue raft. Well, that's what Jesus did for us. He delivered us, rescued us from a hopeless situation. And again, Paul is emphasizing it's Christ. It's what Christ did. It's not what you can add to the gospel through your law keeping. And it's even more amazing when you consider that this rescue, this deliverance, was accomplished for people who hated the deliverer. Because remember, when we got saved, none of us were in love with Christ. He was our enemy. We did whatever we wanted. And so this deliverance is all the more amazing when you remember that we were rebels and enemies, which further compounds or magnifies the heinousness of this false gospel of works plus grace, because it cheapens what Jesus did as our rescuer. Finally, this last portion of this gospel message in verse 4 is the plan. The plan. Look down. It was according to the will of our God and Father. It says nothing about merit, about our accomplishment or achievement. It is simply and solely based on the will of God. He determined to save sinners. And so what that means is we can't import our own works into this equation of salvation as if it merited God's favor. No. Salvation is only, Paul is reminding them, according to the will of God. Which means when you preach a false gospel, these Judaizers, which is what they were doing, that they are not only attacking Christ, they're also attacking the Father. And then lastly, in verse 5, Paul points out that it is all about the glory of God. To whom be the glory. And that's why it matters that we get the gospel right. That's why it matters that we don't infuse works into salvation, as if works could contribute to our salvation. Because then we steal the glory of God, and no longer is He the sole one who accomplished our deliverance, but we contributed. We deserve some of the credit. We deserve some of the glory. Well, Paul says that's ridiculous. The glory belongs simply and solely to God alone. So as we think about Galatians 1, and really just these first 5 verses, we have immense reasons to worship Jesus for what He's done in effecting our salvation and rescue through His own death on the cross, and all to the glory of God. So may that give you eager praise and worship in your own hearts as you think about what God did for us, not what we did in partnership with God. We'll see you tomorrow.